My name is Sven Teske. I'm a research director and associate professor at the University of Technology in Sydney. And we are going to talk today about the international aspects of Made in Australia, investing in a climate resilient economy. And what we are going to do is I start with a little presentation about a research we have done about the potentials for renewables in Australia and different scenarios, and then we take it from there. We look at the international aspect of the renewable energy industry and how Australia is located into that. And then I need, can I get the clicker? Here. Sorry. And then we continue with the presentation from, or intervention from Frank Jozzo about Made in Australia and how renewable energy can be used. And then we wrap up with policy options. Our panelists, short and sharp. Janet Milongo is from the Climate Action Network International. She will walk us through the research CAN International just published. The next intervention is from Professor Dr. Frank Jozzo from the Australian National University. And the next one is intervention is from Anna Freeman. She's the policy director from the Clean Energy Council. And I jump in straight away into my presentation. We start with the carbon budget. Carbon budget for us is, in our research, is basically the key input data. So our aim in the One Earth Climate Model research work we are doing with the University of Technology and the German Aerospace Center is to define targets and pathways for various different countries. And I will present Australia, but we have published more than 40 countries. We did all G20 countries, plus all the EU 27 countries, which we just published actually yesterday. So that's all online. So the carbon budget, in order to remain within 1.5 degree with 60% certainty, is about 420 gigatons. The red line is what we need to do. The scenario, what we present, or what I present, is not a forecast. It's a scenario that says, what do we need to do if we want to actually do that cliff? And that is basically the challenge. The black line is basically, curve is the trend. I mean, the good news is that we are not increasing that much anymore, and we seem to be sort of on the top of the hill, and we might go down in the next few years. But we still have to change a lot. We have different trends, and for me it's very important to mention that when we say 1.5 degree target, that means it's a 50 to 60% certainty of meeting that target. I personally think that we should not stop aiming for 1.5 degree target, but just communicate the certainty. So in our research, we found that if we delay the implementation of what I will show for Australia, we will decrease the chance of meeting the 1.5 degree target every 3 months by 0.1%. So every 3 months delay is a 0.1% less chance to meet the target. The IEA has a net zero scenario as well in 2021, I think, the first one. It has been updated a few times. The carbon budget there is around 500 gigatons, which brings us to a 50% likelihood. The One Earth Climate Model working research, at our university, we have a variety of different experts. We have up to 12 people working on the project. We have mapping experts, we have a chemical industry engineer, we have steel experts, we have basically a whole range, not just energy engineers, and we increasingly add the land use changes and the non-energy greenhouse gas emissions to it. So I think the only message I have here is, besides the rapid decrease of carbon, we also need to have, we need to stop deforestation, we start reforestation, we need to have a land use change, agriculture, and it's not an either or. It's not we need to do this or that, we need to do everything at the same time with quite a significant speed. What we have done, and I want to put this in a context, we have done all the G20 countries in terms of energy scenario. Then we downloaded all the data from the IPCC about historical emissions, and we have a carbon budget, and that's a scientific paper. You can also download that paper online with a graph. We basically have a carbon emission trajectory historically from all the 20 countries, and our projection for the next 30 years until 2050. That gives us a total carbon budget, and then we divided that with the population, with the number of population. So we have an indicator. It's not an exact measurement, but an indicator in terms of the CO2 per capita. The average is, interesting enough, more or less exactly the emissions from China. Everyone above the line needs to pay in a financial scheme. Everyone below the line could receive money. So that's our suggestion for the global stocktake. It is obviously not possible to negotiate physics. So we can't negotiate, we did not pollute in the past, so we can emit now. That is not possible. But we can negotiate money, but not emissions. And we have, and I just wanted to show that, we have a carbon budget for basically all main industries, and that is for Australia. And that's a carbon budget between 2020 and 2050. We also do a sensitivity analysis saying what happens if we have a 5 or 7 year delay with the implementation, what sector is basically the sector which would emit most in that time period. And maybe surprisingly enough, the steel industry wouldn't, because we do not assume that the steel industry will have a rapid reduction of carbon emissions in the next 5 years, because it takes a while to change. And then at the last point, what we do is we do solar and wind assessment in 1 by 1 kilometer blocks for all countries in model. We have done that for 45 countries. Scenario 1 is basically we see what is the potential, excluding all national parks and everything, so where we can't buy utility scale solar. And then we subtract all the power lines and say everything further away than 10 kilometers is also not an option, because there is no grid. I mean, obviously in the middle there's really good solar potential, but there's no infrastructure. So it doesn't make sense to put that into a scenario. So we have done that also for wind. We exclude also areas for the wind industry with lower than 6 meters per second on average, because that won't make sense to build a wind farm. Well, let's say I'm Australian and German. You probably hear from my accent. In my hometown, we build wind farms with 5.5 meters per second, but you shouldn't do that, or you don't have to do that in Australia. And that is an offshore wind assessment as well. So we have offshore wind assessments with fixed bottom and floating fundaments. And usually the potential is dependent on, is there a grid infrastructure anywhere near? Is there a port? And that is basically the main measure. And with this, I have that's the second last slide. We developed for the Climate Council in Australia 3 scenarios. One was sort of one which fits into the G20 with the same trajectory. One was with an even higher ambition to reduce 80% CO2 by 2030, which is quite ambitious. And then we had the same with an export angle. So saying, if we want to export, and that's basically now my segue into the next section, renewable energy in form of maybe hot briquette iron or hydrogen, what is required in terms of electricity. And I will just add, sort of show you the electricity, we have the electricity on the left is basically what Australia needs now, and on the right is what the electricity needed for also the export scenario. So even if we don't export it, we would almost quadruple our electricity demand, and that's due to electrification, to a lot of electrification. The final energy demand will actually go down, but the electricity will go up as we replace fuels with electricity. And that's basically my kickoff for this session. And in order to put that a little bit more in a wider context, I'll hand over to Janet, who will tell us a bit more about where we are actually in the context.
Thank you very much, Professor Sven Teske, and good evening, everybody. My name is Janet Milongo. I work as a Senior Manager Energy Transition at the Climate Action Network International, otherwise known as CAN International. So just a bit of stats. Sorry, Sven? What's wrong there? Not seeing my slides coming up. Okay, there they are. All right. Okay, sorry about that. So just a bit of information that you probably already have on where Australia sits globally. And you probably already know that Australia has a target of achieving 82% clean electricity by 2030. And of this, 38% is on industry, 29% on transport, of which 70% is to account for the total final energy consumption. And just as any other country, electrification is key for decarbonization in Australia, as is the case in the rest of the world. And as far as energy intensity, which is, couples decarbonization efforts and electrification efforts, the IEA ranks Australia 71 out of 147 in the global index. And as far as fossil fuels is concerned, we know that Australia is the 5th biggest coal producer in the world and the 7th largest gas producer in the world. And also a really big historical emitter. And why am I saying all of this? I'm saying all of this because we have a report at CAN International, and we are in the 2nd edition of this report that we've just launched this October, actually. And we call it the Renewable Energy Tracker. It's available on the CAN International website. So just on the homepage, you'll be able to see the Renewable Energy Tracker, of which Australia has been ranked twice in a row, last year, 2023, and this year. So this year's performance of Australia is 20th out of 62 countries. And I'd like to get into the nitty-gritties of Australia's performance. So what is the Renewable Energy Tracker? The tracker is an equitable assessment of countries' performance towards 100% renewables. As I said, this year we analyzed 62 countries, Australia being one of them. And out of these 62, it covers about 85% of the global population and largely focuses on the G20. Sorry? Oh. Sorry, I'm not sure. Okay, all right, I got it now. Okay, so we compare countries in this report by adjusting population and economic size. So this is one of the methodology that we use. And we have different indicators for developed countries and developing countries. And this basically is that for developing countries, we are mapping the progress of decarbonization through renewables with a target of 2040 as the target here. And for developing countries, we base this, or rather we target 2050 for decarbonization by 2050. And we also take into account the different starting points of the different countries. And this is just, speaks to the equity aspect of this report. So the tracking and the comparing goes beyond, the quantity aspects and also looks at quality. And we look at the share of renewables in the total final energy consumption, as well as the role of finance, the role of investments, other aspects such as employment, energy access, and also the share of biomass. And outside of the ranking, the report has, as I said, this is a second issue this year. It's also looking at other key aspects such as critical minerals, community ownership, so more of the quality aspects of the quality of the transition and what that looks like in a country. So as I said, you can find the report in our website, that is climatenetwork.org. On the homepage, all the information would be there. So Australia in the tracker. As I mentioned, the overall ranking is 20 out of 62, and we really believe that this could get better, and that is actually the reason that we are here today, and really looking forward to keep having this conversation so that we can carry on a dialogue of how Australia can meet its decarbonization goals and also its responsibilities globally. The report itself has 5 categories. So we have champions, a champion category. We have a front runner category, moderates, which is self-explanatory, just the countries that are performing averagely. We have trailers and slow starters. For Australia, it ranks within the moderates. And that is why I was saying that this conversation needs to keep going, because we really believe that Australia does have the capability to do better and actually provide leadership to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, Australia in the report has not performed that great as far as its trajectory towards 100% renewables. And especially if we look at economy-wide transition to renewables. So a lot of emphasis on electricity, the electricity sector, but not so much on economy-wide. And that is an area where the country could improve. As of last year, the country's share of renewables was 35% in the power sector, and unfortunately still largely dominated by coal. So in the report, if you look at all the advanced economies, of which, of course, Australia is one, it ranks 17 out of 23 advanced economies featured in the report. As far as planned capacities, Australia is the 3rd best country in terms of planned renewable energy capacities per capita, on per capita basis. And this data correlates with the data of the Global Energy Monitor as well. So this is not just the Renewable Energy Tracker. And as I mentioned before, this is not just about electricity production or growth in the electricity sector. Energy efficiency would also be really, really key to curb the overall demand in Australia. Just as every other country, this is a key concern. And so more needs to be done around energy intensity. Although the energy intensity has also increased between 2022 to 2023, and it needs to significantly reduce by 2030. As far as investments are concerned, it ranks 6 out of 23 other advanced economies. And when you look at it from a perspective of population and economy size, then Australia ranks 15 out of 23. So basically, this means that Australia does have the capacity to do better given its financial capabilities. And another key aspect here, and really the focus of this COP, and a lot of discussions out of this COP, is climate finance. So climate finance within the country, and also the role that Australia would play outside globally in the rest of the world. And we stress the importance of Australia also making a significant contribution to that. And we also stress that this needs to be in the form of public grant-based finance. So Australia has only, marginally increased its grant-based finance, and this is another area that Australia could improve on. Also, and this would also have a correlating effect in its performance in the report, because as I said, it's an equity-based report, and it looks at all of these factors to determine the ranking of the country. So when it comes to the last bit there on the benefits that Australia could gain by making a very deliberate switch to renewable energy, I think this is all stuff that you probably know better than I do. And it's improvement in sectors such as the health sector, of course, jobs, of course, access it would be improved, and the quality of electricity and energy would be improved based on, the possibility of decentralized and community-owned projects. So I'll leave it at that for today, and I'm happy to take any questions afterwards and also discuss further about the report, and really invite you all to take a look at the report. Thank you very much.
All right, the second half will be talk. We all sit there. And we start, we all will sit there, and we start with Frank, and then Anna, and then we take it from there. Is that, yeah. Frank, I talked a bit about the potential of renewables and different scenarios, but what does that actually mean for the industry sector in Australia, and what are the options also in the international context in terms of export?
Yeah, if we step back a little and think of a world that really decarbonizes, that really gets to net zero, then you're looking at a world that has a new geography of energy, obviously, right? Because we'll be using so much less fossil fuel and so much more renewable power. And we're also looking at a reorganization of the geography of global heavy industry to an extent. Namely, we will see a geographic shift of heavy industries closer to where renewable energy is abundant and cheap, right? And where you have the preconditions to actually locate heavy industry production, like fertilizer, basic ammonia, like importantly green iron and other metals. Okay, and so that fundamentally is something that Australia and other like geographies can benefit from. Now, you raised the point of investments and investment indicators. I would share with you the impression that in Australia, we're looking at a really pent-up investment demand. We're looking at a massively huge opportunity in industrial decarbonization, including to build up the industries that can then export green commodities to other countries, like green iron that can go into the steel mills of East Asia, of Europe and elsewhere. But that investment hasn't happened yet, right? It's a chicken and egg situation to an extent, right? It's a matter of large corporates being poised to make those investments, but also in a situation where costs, of course, are still coming down. So if you make that investment now, you might find that perhaps you've made that investment in technology that might be significantly cheaper 5 years down the track, and that's really, I think, where we what we see that transition in the domestic electricity grid happening really fast, right? Really deep transition underway right now. For the clean industry of the future. We're now in that sort of positioning stage, right, where we're looking at potential and options, and where we're hopefully looking at an avalanche of investment over the next 1 or 2 decades, I would have thought.
Thank you, Frank. I think we can't do anything if we don't have the right policy in place. And Anna, that's definitely your expertise. You know exactly what's going on in Australia, so tell us.
And here was me thinking I knew how to make a microphone work. Thank you, Sven. Can I start by just saying that I express some hope that your next report might be a little bit more positive about the renewable energy transition in Australia. The numbers are a little bit better than what you showed. We were 39.4% of renewables of the total electricity in Australia, and that was double what it was 5 years ago. So we've had one of the fastest transitions, and in fact, in the IEA World Energy Outlook that was released a couple of weeks ago, they showed that Australia is pretty much having one of the fastest renewable energy transitions of any country. So by the end of next year, based on what's being constructed now, we're expecting that we will probably be pushing up towards 48% renewables. So we're currently just over 40, and by the time we've got that kit installed and generating by the end of next year, we'll be at 48% or so. So I'm extremely excited about just how rapidly it is happening, and in states like South Australia, you know, they expect that they're going to be 100% renewables within a matter of a few years. That bodes really well. I guess if we're going to go to the question about the sorts of topics that we're talking about today on the panel in relation to the future made in Australia, I think the government actually has done a lot, so much. They've just released the largest package of measures to support green manufacturing in Australia using our leveraging and our renewable energy base. A lot of support for hydrogen, which we're waiting to be legislated, but that's a $6.7 billion just with a hydrogen production tax incentive, and then there's another $4 billion through a hydrogen Head Start, which will be a CFD, a contract for difference, essentially administered by this man sitting in the front row, Darren Miller, at ARENA. And those things we are really hopeful are going to kickstart the large-scale production of hydrogen in Australia. And that would really be an important input ingredient in green metals manufacturing and all sorts of other sort of green manufacturing in Australia. So there is a lot going on, and this government has really sort of pulled out all stops. The one thing that is missing at the moment is that we don't really have the demand drivers. I think in many respects probably the story in Australia, because we're not a Germany where, you know, there's very old and very large centres of industrial manufacturing, and we've got a relatively small population base and very dispersed population as well. I think we're struggling with the, you know, who are we supplying, because on the hydrogen front at the moment, for example, we're not big consumers of hydrogen in Australia, so there's not quite enough to build an industry on, so the international demand piece is quite important. The alternative is we make our own demand by leveraging and taking that opportunity in things like green metals, which is that green iron and green steel piece that Frank and I will be talking about on a panel tomorrow morning at 9 a.m, Sven, just in case anyone's interested. That's a huge opportunity for Australia. And then obviously the shipping opportunity is huge in terms of demand and the pull-through factor. The IMO at the moment is considering some greenhouse gas emissions standards, which should be decided within the coming months. And that will start to see requirements on shipping lines to start decarbonising their fuel sources, and that's going to be a game changer, I think, for hydrogen. So there are things going on. I guess initially, though, to scale up our own industry, there's a need for some local demand as well, because you don't go from zero to hero overnight. You need a pathway to get there. And we have our own heavy industry to decarbonise too, that do need these to be able to leverage that renewable energy advantage. And so I think what we're really hoping is that through some processes that are underway at the moment in policy land, that we may start to see something like, I don't know, mandates or certificate schemes or other things that could potentially be placed on those that might need to start ultimately using these renewable fuels over time. So in green iron, green steel, there's an opportunity for those metals, and then renewable fuels is another area where I think, you know, the aviation sector, the shipping sector, they need these solutions, and we need to start scaling up our ability to provide them. And that's not going to happen on its own, because the price premiums of those fuels is like 3 to 5 times what it is for a fossil fuel. And so unless you have something to enforce those industries to use them, why should you be a first mover? And so we actually need governments to help create a level playing field so that everybody needs to start taking action together, and that you, a private player, is not disadvantaged by being an early mover.
Yeah, I think that brings us to another point, which, like with two passports, come talking with two sides. I know that the German steel industry doesn't really like the idea of, to some extent, getting HBI, because their value chain is sort of a bit lower.
Hot bricketed, which HBI?
Yeah, HBI. So that's one thing, but also you need a long-term plan, and that's mainly the problem, that there is no international long-term plan. As the German government just crumbled and will have a new election in February, so there will be no real decision in the next few months either. But I think I will come back to sort of the first phase of building up infrastructure and the industry. Frank, what do you think? What are the main steps over the next, let's say, 5 years to actually build this up, to have some support?
Yeah, I mean, next 5 years, I suppose we might see perhaps one large installation, 2 in Australia for green iron production. That will be the base. Yeah, some of this may start on a basis of gas, and then hopefully be converted to green hydrogen relatively quickly. But look, I mean, the next 5 years, I would contend, is not really where you see the bulk of the action, right? This is a game for the 2030s, 2040s. We have overcapacity in conventional steel production the world over. This is very much a case of gradual capital stock turnover. We never used to think in our decarbonisation roadmaps that green steel was something that would be early on in a global energy transition, right? It was always clear that this is something that's relatively backloaded, because, you know, the additional cost is real and present, right? It is not as cheap to make iron and steel on a low or zero carbon route as it is with conventional coal-based processes, plus we have all of this capital in place. What needs to happen is, firstly, for Australia, further technological development to make green iron production economically competitive on the basis of hematite, which is the dominant ore type in Australia. It's easier to do this with magnetite. There's some magnetite in Australia, but there's a lot more magnetite in Brazil and other places, right? So more R&D on that, okay? And then secondly, get some investment going, get something happening on the ground in order to gain experiences and demonstrate that this can actually be done. I think those are the two things that need to happen. Happy to talk more about policy, but I won't dominate the floor at this point.
Yeah, just as my question to you, Anna, about the energy side. We have seen we will have a significant increase of electricity for any plans of export. Even if we don't do that, we still have the domestic electrification of the transport sector will increase the electricity demand and heat pumps. So what do you see are the main levers in terms of infrastructure, like expansion of grids? What do you see in the next 5 to 10 years as the main policy options?
Yeah, it's a little bit scary to talk about the numbers. We need probably 3 times the size of the grid that we have today to support the transition just domestically. But if you're looking at the superpower story, it's so much larger. The Australian Energy Transitions Initiative did a study about 18 months ago that was finished, and it was said that if we were going to, I think, take advantage of our opportunities with green metals and all sorts of other decarbonisation and the high amounts of electrification required for industry in Australia. And they just looked at 5 key industries. Can't remember them all. On the green metals, aluminium, LNG. People in the audience will probably remember them better than I do. Anyway, it looked at sort of 40 times. 6 times, I think, the power required of what we have today. And then the Net Zero Australia report said that if we replaced all of our fossil fuel exports today with the same value of green exports, so switched out coal export value, LNG export value, and said instead we're exporting hydrogen and we're exporting green metals, etc., it's 40 times the amount of electricity required. The system would have to be 40 times greater. So the numbers are eye-poppingly large, and I guess the question is, what does that look like? Where are these places? Where is that going to be? Some of them will be near the population centres. Obviously, that's the main sort of, for where the industry exists. But I think there are going to need to be also large expansions in places that are close to the minerals resources, obviously. So the Pilbara, northwest Australia, South Australia, which has got a great magnetite resource, Queensland, some of these areas, and not necessarily on the actual grid now, but they might be other grids that are built to support that. So, look, it's a big ask. I guess what we need from government in many respects is that strategic planning overlay of where are these big opportunities, and there's a very large sort of capital outlay to make this possible, whether you're talking about green steel mills or the transmission infrastructure or any of those things. It might be required for hydrogen. You might need desal plants near the coastlines, port upgrades. How are you going to get the renewable energy equipment in, all of the wind turbines that we require? Have we actually got the port infrastructure to bring it in? There is so much to think about, and it needs a real strategic plan in particular regions in order to make it viable to achieve it at the scale that we need. And I think probably at the moment that's an area where we've got probably more of a patchwork approach, and there's an opportunity for some sort of whole of nation building sort of vision and planning at a coordinated level, a centralised level.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point in terms of acceptance. I mean, in our scenario, we have the electricity demand increases from around 400 terawatt to 1300, so 3-4 times, which means you need a lot of public acceptance as well. And I think that is only possible if you take the population somehow with you in those plans. And I think good communication is one thing. And that's, you want to speak to that? I mean, the public acceptance of wind.
Well, Sven, it was the very first session that I hosted here. I think it was yesterday at the Global Renewables Alliance Pavilion, was on the question of how do we bring communities along, because it is something that is not special to Australia, but that we are all struggling with. In fact, we heard the story of a couple of wind farms in Kenya, in which some wind turbines from GE arrived and they never ever got put up because the community was concerned about the impacts of wind energy generation in their community. So we know it's a very real risk to projects, and I know that sounds like I'm speaking with my industry hat on. It's a very big commercial risk that we don't get these things right. I think there is a lot of focus. There is a lot of focus by my industry on it, but we know how fragile that support is because, as we've talked about, for sort of the basic scenario in Australia, we need to triple the size of our electricity system. How do we bring the community along on the way and make sure, and it's not even just the race to 2030, we need to build 6 gigawatts a year, every year now until 2030. But we need to keep going, and then we need to be able to replace it, and it needs to be there for the long term. So the sustained support over time, and I think it will only work if communities feel that they've been treated fairly and that they have gotten something out of it. And so there's a lot of work going on in Australia on looking at benefit sharing models and how we do that. I think there's a question of, is that something that governments should say, this is what you need to do? Or is it about, I guess, a more, do you leave it to the proponents to work it out? There's risks with both of those things, but one of the key messages that came through in our community session yesterday that really, even if you went around paying, you can't pay communities off or whatever because they're not going to feel necessarily that was fair treatment. What you need is actually a deep understanding of the issues and the concerns and working with those communities to try and work out how you can find a way to develop a project that will have their support. What does that look like? And I think the projects that are doing it really well are those that have had that dialogue with those communities and found a way through. It's not feasible for us not to do this nation building work. We have to do it, so we have to find a way through.
Janet, could you speak to the example Anna just said about the wind farm in Kenya?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And maybe before I touch on the example itself, I think I'm first encouraged by what you've shared and that realization. And I would like to add to that with the point that as we transition now globally, and in this case Australia, we need to realize that we need to change our energy system and our approach to energy. It's community energy. It needs to serve the people, it needs to benefit people, lives, livelihoods, and biodiversity. So that type of approach is what, and that type of approach to free, prior, and informed consent is what will be the lever rather for us to get it right, because the social license for some of these projects is an issue all over the world, as you said. It's not just in Australia. In Kenya, we have the Lake Turkana wind farm, which is actually supposed to be the biggest wind farm in the country. And you'd imagine for a developing country, the reception would, be positive. But where a project or proponents of a project have not looked at what are the community needs or even the understanding of the community of this project, of this resource, and what it means for their lives, not what the proponents think it means for their lives, because of course we have compensation models and all of this, but what does that community actually want? Because they're giving up a piece of their land, they're giving up their livelihoods, their way of life to some extent, to have this project near them. They have expectations. Unfortunately, we have, economical challenges all over the world. So seeing a project coming, in your neighborhood, there are expectations as well. So I think this is not a one-size-fits-all. It could be subjective to some extent, that the engagement with the communities needs to be done with very good intent, very good will. As I said, in good time and as frequently as is possible, because of course I know there's at some point, we need to move past the talking and actually the doing, but the community needs to feel part of the project. And that is the idea of the energy system that we want. We should change how energy systems have run and operated and the ideology behind them, and have one that everybody feels part. And that's the advantage that renewables offers as well. Communities can actually even own part of their energy system. So those are some of the challenges that were faced in Lake Turkana as well. I think it was just an issue of not understanding the community, the context as well. That particular area is, the land tenureship is communal, so that provides its own issues. I think land use issues are also not unique to Kenya anyway, or the developing world, or Africa. Australia as well has its own fair share. So it needs to be very subjective, and once you have the community with you, and both ends are working towards the betterment of the community, of the system, then you have that understanding and it's likely to succeed. But yes, definitely opposition is a huge issue around the world.
Frank, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and just continuing along those lines. I mean, the vision of a community-integrated renewable energy system with strong local acceptance is, of course, a beautiful one, and in many instances should be able to be achieved for local energy supply, right? So where the benefit goes directly to the local communities. Now, what we're talking in industrial systems, right, is unfortunately a whole different game, right? So the amount of energy that is currently used and will be used in future to create the base commodities that our global economy relies on. So just to take two of them, steel and fertilizer, and there's many other metals and many other chemical products, right, require absolutely humongous amounts of energy that we're currently satisfying from the mining and oil and gas extraction system, right, which is a big, ugly, polluting system, right, that sits in some parts of the world and creates enormous economic rents where it is, and therefore create some acceptance for where it is, where that big, ugly system is, right, or it is entrenched by way of its own economic power that it has, right? So what we're about to do, hopefully for climate change, right, is to transpose that kind of system onto renewable energy, right? We will have big, ugly industrial systems that are fed by wind and solar power, and that's how it needs to be in order to stay below 2 degrees, right? But we're not going to miraculously solve the issue of local environmental impacts and local community impacts, right? Those need to be, in a sense, compensated for by apportioning a stream of the revenue, a part of the economic rent generated by these industrial facilities, to the community, to environmental purposes, to social purposes, right? And so I think really ultimately it comes down to the economic cornerstones of this and the cornerstones of fiscal policy and regulatory frameworks, right? So make these new green industries acceptable to the community at large. And when I use the word community, I don't just mean the people who live locally, although that's very important, especially with indigenous communities. I mean the whole nation, right? There needs to be enough benefit to nations that host these industries in the long term in order for that to be a fair deal.
And I think that's a good leeway into another aspect I see is sort of a long-term infrastructural planning, which is, for example, for offshore wind, very easily we can see that we don't even have the installation ships right now in Australia. So we need the shipping, the skills, and being a professor at the university, we need also the education. We basically need to the education system to provide the right skills, the right trainings for future scenarios. So at the end of the day, if we really honest with our scenarios, we actually need to step back and say, what do we actually need in terms of what kind of skills, and when do we need to start training, because it takes us 5 to 7 years. Huh?
Now,
yeah. I mean, we do, our university is involved in planning like that. But one thing is we have the plan, and the other thing is when do we actually implement it in the system. And that is basically, I think, that is not just education. I think that is also policy, as we need to move into preparation of new courses and of new trainings. And there is, frankly, also an economic risk for a university to start a course or start a new series of seminars, and we have no one to subscribe, and no one will actually will visit the courses, and we can't get the bumps on the seat, to be perfectly honest.
we just need to make sure that the UTS ads for how much a grid connection engineer earns in Australia right now, that should fill the room, I think.
I mean, realistically, this is a role for government as well,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, the amount of places at university at undergraduate level made available in specific fields is determined by government, right? And so we've got a wonderful study in Australia by Jobs, what's it called? The Jobs and Skills Australia on skills needs for the energy transition, lays it all out, massive skills gap, massive future, massive requirement for engineers, electricians, plumbers and so forth, and I'm yet to see that translated into even a semblance of government action in changing something in the education and vocational skills and university training system. So hello, anyone who's listening, Australian federal government has a job to do. You've identified what the job is.
If there's nothing from the panel, we still have 5 minutes if we have some questions from the audience or remarks.
He doesn't have anything to say, but he's going to get a microphone.
I've been told I have a question. A remark. No, I have a question. So I think one of the challenges in the transition is it's so cross-functional in terms of touching on all parts of the economy, up and down the supply chain, and horizontally you've just talked about skills. How does a government effectively coordinate its action when it's organised itself into silos, in a sense, that look after certain parts of the economy? And just even thinking about the sectoral plans, which has oversight from Minister Bowen in the climate change and energy portfolio, but it's touching on infrastructure, transport, jobs, the tax code, the treasury. It's a very challenging problem to set a policy agenda that meets all of those criteria. What's the best way to set that up at a policy level to make it work?
I'm looking at Sam Lowe, who has got this job. I don't know the answer to it. I mean, this is the role of central agencies in many respects in government, of trying to pull this together when there's an area of centralised focus, which, I mean, it can be hard to do because then those central agencies don't necessarily have the expertise on one particular thing, like communities, etc. But I think we do need probably the highest level of focus and strategic planning, and those functions bringing it all together. You could see, Jobs and Skills Australia, for example. I mean, probably the most important thing that it's done is actually said, what are the numbers we need by when? Do we even know that? And then you do, and then you go, okay, well, we need this many sparkies, and we need this many plumbers, and we need this many grid connection engineers, and we need this many wind technicians, and whatever it is, we actually need to set that all out. And then with the states, work together to come up with a plan to make sure that we've got those skills in the various areas and who's able to fill them. So that's it. I think probably, I think the federal government has got such an important role to play now. They've made it clear through the agenda, and that's why the agenda is so important. But yeah, and that's probably, and it's a relief that the federal government has stepped up in that regard.
There was another, yeah.
Cool, thank you. Hi, Andrea Leong from We Planet Australia. I was wondering actually if this would be an energy-focused panel, thanks to all the speakers, by the way. Given that the majority of our emissions come from energy, but we've got 1/6 or so that comes from food. I was wondering if there's any comments on that, especially with regards to Made in Australia and investing in Australia's industries, because food is such a big part of Australia's industries as well. And sorry, I was also wondering about the... no, let's start with that.
I think with this session we focused on energy. By not talking about food doesn't mean that we don't think it's not important. It's just that was the focus. I think land use change is obviously a very important aspect over the future and to coordinate that also with energy, because energy at some point needs also land. I would like to wrap up and just have one international example where I think it actually worked quite well, sort of the long-term thinking. And it's a democracy, a very small democracy, and it's Denmark. Denmark announced the wind target in 1997 for offshore wind and onshore wind, and they are still on track, and they never changed the target. They actually have, they had a long discussion, they have a long talk. It's a very Scandinavian way of discussing everything to death. At some point you make a decision and then you actually stick to it for decades. And I think that's a good way of doing it.
When did you say 1997 was that target? Or?
That was in 1997, right. Svend Auken announced the offshore wind and onshore wind target and done for 2020 and 2030, and Denmark is 2 years ahead of schedule. And they're still there. It's still there, and they actually organized the heating transition now, which is enormous. But that's, I think that's the only example I have.
Love it.
All right, we need to wrap up. It's 5:30 sharp. Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the panelists. Anna and Frank jumped in very, very short notice. You might have noticed a little bit uncoordination. That's my fault, but thank you very much.
And Sven, stop talking now.